Hello.
You're listening to The Beautiful Idea,
a podcast from a collective of several anarchist and autonomous media producers scattered around the world.
We're bringing you interviews and stories from the front lines of autonomous social movements and struggles, as well as original commentary and analysis.
Follow us on Mastodon and at thebeautifulidea.show.
Thanks for listening.
Hello, and thanks for listening to The Beautiful Idea. With Trump's inauguration, concerns around access to abortion and miscarriage care are increasing, and lots of communities are working to make access to abortion, including self-managed abortion, more feasible. Today, I'm going to be talking with two people, Jane and Hazel, who know a lot about self-managed abortion and the different ways that people are working together to make it more accessible for people who need it. So to kick us off, can you both please introduce yourselves for our listeners?
Hey, so my name is Jane. I use they, her, she pronouns, and I am an abortion companion or doula working in Western North Carolina and more broadly in Appalachia. And I work alongside several different crews of people and also as an individual, but I work and support the Mountain Area Abortion Doula Collective.
Hi there, my name is Hazel. I use they, them pronouns. I am an abortion doula and a former clinic worker living in the Rust Belt and in a red state. I am also the author of a zine called How to Do It Anyway, which is a guide to self-managing an abortion at home, and that was released through Strangers in a Tangled Wilderness last year.
Okay, thanks to both of you for being here, and we're going to talk more about that zine in just a little bit. Can you tell us what is reproductive justice and what kind of experience do you both have working on it? Like, how would you define it? And Jane, maybe you can start on that.
Yeah, sure. So I think it's really important to ground in the knowledge that reproductive justice is a framework that was specifically invented and continues to be led by and primarily used by Black women and non-binary people. It was invented in Cairo in the 90s, I think, at a specific summit. The specific term was coined then. So it's specifically there's a lot of conceptual elements to the idea of RJ, but a really important piece of that of the idea of reproductive justice is people should be free to choose to have children or not children and live in a world where it is safe to parent the children they already have, along with decolonizing the concept of sex and pleasure. But I think it's really critical that as a white person myself, I don't specifically identify as okay, I do reproductive justice work. I support and I flank the work of folks doing reproductive justice work, and I approach my own abortion support work through a reproductive justice lens, but that work belongs to and is the provenance of Black and brown folks of color, and specifically addresses institutional racism within the more liberal abortion rights movement. I guess addressing how I've done that work, I think a lot, specifically MAADCO is as an organization really strives to center the ideas and leadership of Black folks and center also the needs of Black folks in our communities, and that's an ongoing process and not something I'm saying we're great at or we've completed that process yet. But I think a lot of the work also means recognizing the intersections between reproductive justice and other forms of abolition work. For example, the jail in Asheville is one of the most terrible jails in the entire state. And we were just doing some work supporting somebody who was in the jail and was pregnant and was forced to give birth in jail. So kind of organizing our principles of reproductive freedom and autonomy around the idea that anybody should be able to author these decisions for themselves, and all forms of state violence and state control interfere with that decision making, if that makes sense.
Totally. And thanks for that rundown. Could you say the name of that organization that you mentioned again?
The Mountain Area Abortion Doula Collective.
Okay, great. Thanks. Hazel, did you have anything to add to that definition?
Yeah, I really appreciated all of what you had to say, Jane. And I think my one addition is just that reproductive justice is often trying to address the sort of inadequacies of like a pro-choice framework from the more mainstream like pro-choice abortion rights movement. And that specifically a lot of that movement has often focused on like the right to have an abortion in ways that kind of leave behind more marginalized, oppressed people, poor folks, poor women, people of color, Black women especially. And it was specifically an intervention, right, trying to say that like choice isn't enough, we have to have access. It is like one thing to have a theoretical right from the government to be able to end an unwanted pregnancy, but how do we actually, you know, like one isn't actually free to choose unless they are able to afford that abortion, or they're able to get transportation there, or they're able to have childcare. And so reproductive justice is often thinking like much more in like a systemic way and sort of foregrounding access. And again, to Jane's point, like, again, I as a white person, I don't want to, this is not territory that, I think that Jane just said it really well. Like, I strive to be in support of reproductive justice and I operate from a reproductive justice lens, but like also with the really strong like knowledge and deference and honor towards like the Black women who have built this work before us.
Cool. I think that's a really helpful overview. So getting right into it, what is a self-managed or medication abortion for people who don't know? And how is it different from what's known as procedural or surgical abortions?
So typically when we think of accessing abortion, people will think about going to a clinic and either look at a procedural abortion, which is where a clinical practitioner, often a doctor, is kind of using gentle suction to empty the contents of the uterus. People might have some kind of sedation while they do this, or people are like thinking about going to a clinic to get some pills, and then they take the pills at home and are basically inducing a miscarriage, causing the uterus to bleed and to cramp and to pass the pregnancy with the use of the medication. A self-managed abortion is kind of all of the abortion that happens outside of clinics, where like instead of having a doctor there to manage the abortion, like you are the one who is taking that on. Self-managed abortion can look a lot of different ways. The zine that I wrote is specifically addressing and giving some instructions and support for people who are choosing to access pills and medication abortion outside of clinics. There is a lot of other legacy and current practice of other kinds of abortion happening outside of clinic spaces. There are anecdotal, pretty underground networks of trained non-medical lay people who are able to provide a procedural abortion underground, herbal abortion as well. But I think the thing that is really special and exciting about self-managing an abortion with medication is that we know that medication is super, super safe to take. And these like big international public health organizations in the past couple of years, such as the World Health Organization, have started to come out and explicitly advocate that people should be able to access pills and take them without having to go to a doctor's office, without having to go to a clinic. That the procedure is simple enough and safe enough that we should be able to do it ourselves. We should be able to do it anyway.
Yeah, thank you. And I think you already kind of spoke to this a little bit, Hazel, but Jane, I'm wondering if maybe you would like to add to it. I was going to ask about the history of self-managed abortions, if you all know anything about that. And you're talking about access to medication, but I'm wondering if there's other information about the history of self-managed abortions.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fascinating. There's certainly historians that would know much more about this than I do, but and I'll try not to be like too nerdy or long-winded. But I mean, I think an important thing to note is that before the development of like the contemporary medical industrial complex, the primacy of midwives and midwifery across the globe, really, but like speaking specifically to like the Western context that Hazel and I are both situated in, was like how so many people accessed generative or reproductive health care in general. And it's also really interesting and important to note that there weren't, even from like institutional and oppressive like churches, and even from like the Catholic Church, there weren't actual like edicts against abortion until I believe, like the second half of the 19th century. And so really when we see the advent of like criminalization of abortion also kind of corresponds to the development of the medical industrial complex and to the development of this reality where it was really became only accessible under certain circumstances for certain people to get an abortion from a doctor, probably if you had access to wealth and were white, cis and straight, but also that like, I think it also corresponds to the like really coercive, like criminalization of midwives and the loss of some of that knowledge. But, you know, there's like interesting, I won't go into too many anecdotes, but even like thinking and like, you know, that there's interesting like catalogs that you can still sometimes find from like the 18th century or something of people like buying like tansy and some different herbs that were like sold as little packages that people would take. And I know specifically with our contemporary practice of using medication was really developed by various feminist movements in Latin America. And I'm not sure, maybe Hazel can speak more to the specific history of that, but developed from a lot of like interesting experimentation with misoprostol, which is a medication I'm sure we'll talk about later. And people basically figuring out like, okay, this medication is actually also prescribed for ulcers and some other ailments, so it's more accessible. And how can we use it to induce a miscarriage? And so want to like honor the folks that did that like really incredible and I'm sure incredibly difficult and painful work to discover those things. So yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, Hazel, do you have anything to add to that, especially to the piece around the beginning of medication abortion or originating, I think it was in Brazil, no, by people there?
Yeah. I've heard Brazil, I've heard Mexico. I think like this is all oral history, right? But I think that really speaks to like this reality that most of the abortion infrastructure that we have like exist, even if like you go to a clinic right now, comes from people trying to figure out how to give themselves abortions. Before Roe v. Wade in America or in other contexts where abortion was criminalized. And so like what Jane said of like feminists in Latin America experimenting with misoprostol. The implements used in a procedural abortion were developed in a sort of DIY, they called it self-help at the time, abortion clinic in Santa Monica in the late 1960s. And like the sort of abortion counseling and like full patient healthcare for abortion was really pioneered by the Jane Collective in Chicago in the 1960s. That was like an underground network of direct action abortion providers who were kicking ass and doing like clinic levels of abortions, and also had like a very robust counseling and emotional support and childcare network. The Janes are really cool. You should make your own decisions, but I would recommend going to doing some research about them and looking into that history.
Great. And isn't there like a pretty good documentary about them that was on Netflix, at least for a while, called the Jane Collective or something?
Yeah, the one that I watched, and I'm remembering, I think it was on HBO, but it was just sort of like it was interviews with former Janes, just sort of talking about their experience and telling the story. Yeah, so that's a good resource. There's endless zines. There's a good podcast from cool people who did cool stuff about that history as well.
So I'm wondering what sorts of community support networks exist around self-managed abortions and how those networks have historically come to be. And I know that's a really broad question because, of course, it's place specific, but what are some of the ways that you all have seen different communities come together to help provide self-managed abortions to the people in their communities who need them? And you can take that wherever you'd like to. Let's start with you, Jane.
Yeah, I actually got to meet one of the Janes from the Jane Collective a couple of years ago, which was such a giddy moment. But thinking about and honoring their work and like their specific, like really, I think, astute use of whisper networks and like gossip networks, and also like helpful like mechanisms around security culture. Like I know they would like have a different place where their sort of like front desk area was, and they would take people to another place, I think is a really helpful model. But I also want to take us back to something Hazel said earlier when they were talking about the lineage of reproductive justice and recognizing that, you know, there is no, like, rights are meaningless without access. And I think in the reality of where I've done all of the abortion support work I've ever done in the US Southeast, like the reality for so many people, and particularly Black women and like Latina folks, but for everyone, is that like abortion has not been accessible in a legal clinical setting for so many people for so long. And so these networks have already existed. People have already been doing this relational work to build trust in their communities and to disseminate information. And there's so many different practices that I think are like culturally specific to folks. And I know in my own like comprehension, you know, a lot of what it looks like is people like relying on these decentralized webs, because that both keeps us safe, it protects our identities, and it allows us to be more flexible in how we meet needs. And I think that the shifting the framework from self-managed abortion to like community supported abortion or community managed abortion is really helpful, both in our understanding of the work, but also I think it's something that can actually feel a little bit less like terrifying to people at an individual level. When you talk about SMA, I think maybe a lot of people like already feel so isolated in their experiences and feel so fucking shamed, you know? And I think that like taking abortion out of the soul space of this like super atomized individualistic experience to like a network of care and friendship. Another thing that the Janes and others did in the 70s is they formed friendship circles where they would like learn about different abortion practices together with circles of folks. So bringing it back into that collective realm is important. And I've seen things that are like really as simple and basic as people delivering like care packages to folks, to like more complex counseling of folks, to offering a lot of like transportation needs are huge. Because even as we're talking about abortions outside of clinics, like a lot of people are still needing to go to clinics, even if to just access all ultrasounds. And so providing that kind of transportation assistance has been really big from what I've seen. And then, of course, like providing ways for folks to safely access the medication or other mechanisms is something I've seen.
Thanks for that. I'm wondering if we can define or maybe help outline what are the kind of political implications of grassroots abortion support versus state, quote unquote, state provided or nonprofit or medical industrial abortion support.
Yeah, I mean, I think like abortion clinics do good work and it is like important to support them. And there are like a lot of reasons why people would still want to, you know, even if you have to drive a couple of hours and it takes a long time, like there's still plenty of really valid reasons that people would want to seek an abortion in a clinic, you know? And so I think that it is important to, you know, kind of like Jane was talking about earlier, to find ways to like, you know, we want to increase access to abortion in general, you know, and not just this stuff. But there, you know, there's also, that isn't what everybody's life looks like. You know, not everybody can drive several hours, or, you know, not everybody has childcare for that amount of time. And I think like some key differences that come up for me when I'm thinking about like at least my work, the abortion clinic here, and, you know, thinking more about like self-managed and community supported abortion networks, are mostly like that it is super fucking expensive to go to a clinic, especially if you live in a state that requires 2 appointments. In the state where I live, there's a 24-hour mandated waiting period because the state wants to make sure that you like really know what your decision is or whatever. But like having those 2 separate appointments, having to take work off for the 2 days, having to take work off for the week afterwards to recover. And access to sedation is really important. Like it is really important for people to have the pain management that they need. And also that stuff is really expensive. And so like one of the really big advantages of self-managed abortion is that it is significantly cheaper to order medication online. I think, like, you know, if we're thinking about sort of the political implications, right? Healthcare in a clinic setting, medical industrial complex sort of in general is really kind of based on this hierarchy of expertise, right? You have a doctor at the top, and like that's the person who provides the abortion, and then there's sort of this descending network of registered nurses, you know, medical assistants, non-medical people who all have like very restricted and regimented roles and are all, you know, sort of looking up the hierarchy. And I think that one of the real gifts of like community supported abortion, and Jane was sort of touching on this earlier again, right, is that we get to kind of step outside of that hierarchy of expertise. We get to, you know, take back, the Janes were also all about this, of like taking back autonomy and control over your healthcare experience, you know, and also like building skills and learning about things and feeling more empowered because like you get to be the one who is deciding if your abortion is complete or not. And I definitely think that there is time and a place for a medical hierarchy. You know, I'm someone who's had cancer before, and I definitely benefited from like very skilled surgeons in that context. And I also think that our community is benefited when we all have more skills, right? You don't have to like know how to perform a surgical abortion, but can you learn how to dose pills? Or can you get really good at helping someone make a decision, you know, after they found out that they're pregnant and figuring out what they're going to do? Or can you provide someone some emotional support or some, you know, accompaniment as they're moving through some really big stuff and really intense body stuff, you know, like how can we use this as an opportunity to build skills and build capacity, build trust with each other? Those are sort of the big things that I'm thinking about, but I'm wondering, Jane, if you have anything else to say.
Yeah, that was so beautifully put. I love that recognition of like why it feels good to like invert or untangle the medical hierarchy as somebody who does work in healthcare myself. But yeah, I think the one or the two quick things I would add, one like a very tangible item is I think another political implication of accessing not just abortion, but any kind of miscarriage management or any kind of generative reproductive healthcare inside of a hospital or clinic setting is that it places vulnerable people at a much higher risk of state repression. I know that there have been incidents where nurses or doctors or other institutional figures like unfriendly to abortion have reported people who they like suspected of self-managing or have variously like criminalized people. And also there's like a lot of hospitals engage with law enforcement and some even engage with ICE. And so just thinking about like that setting in particular as one that's like very much entangled with like these different forms of like control societies that we're trying to liberate ourselves from. And another like kind of more woo or subtle thing, but something that I've been thinking about a lot differently is the difference between pain and suffering. And I think, you know, the reality is that like abortion for most people is very painful, but I think suffering is really exacerbated when people feel alone, when they feel that they don't have networks of support to cushion them, and when they feel a sense of total loss of control. And that's not to say that that can't happen outside of the clinic setting, but I think that there's like, because of the reality of how overworked most clinic workers are, even if their intentions are great, like a lot of people like don't enter those spaces emotionally feeling that like richness of care that I would hope folks doing community supported abortion work could provide. So that's just another thought.
Thank you both. Those are really thorough and thoughtful answers. So why do you all think it's important to move away from language that stigmatizes self-management? And I think it would be helpful to maybe give some examples of that kind of language because it's so baked into a lot of the culture.
Yeah, I mean, to give some examples, right, like coat hanger imagery is pretty common in like abortion rights, abortion access movements. And I don't want to be too graphic here, but, you know, sort of evoking the like urban myth, urban legend that like one could induce an abortion with a coat hanger. You know, statements like abortion should be safe, legal, and rare. are kind of like conflating abortion safety with abortion legality, and especially conflating that with clinics, as well as also having this extra dig that like maybe people shouldn't be like, you should only be getting an abortion if it's like super desperate and you're like the most deserving person, which is silly. Your reason for having an abortion is good enough. And so I think for me, right, like moving away from language that's stigmatizing towards self-management. Again, I think it's important to protect legality and also to like fight for decriminalization of self-management. We know that criminalization does force people underground and can force people into situations that are exploitative, you know, as well as opening people up for further state repression. And also, we know a lot about managing an abortion with medication. We know a lot about these drugs, mifepristone and misoprostol. We know from experiments and from clinical data that these drugs are super safe, and it's relatively easy to explain how to use them, and that people are perfectly capable of, you know, knowing how far along in their pregnancy that they are. People are very capable of determining whether or not the medication was effective. And it is most important to make sure that people know that they have options, right? Because more options, more safe options, more accessible options, that's how we care for each other. That's how we keep each other safe. And that's how we keep ourselves out of situations of desperation and move into empowerment.
Yeah, I super resonate with everything you said, Hazel. And I think just the only thing I'd really add is part of self-managed abortion or community-supported abortion is important because any right the state can give, the state can take away. And so it is like both like by so many folks like emotional, psychic, economic, geographic preference that they would have out of clinic abortions, but it also is a political reality. And as Hazel said, I think the catastrophizing around abortion as this like incredibly unsafe or like damaging procedure like represents a win of like the Overton window and the like on the narratives of the far right, when in reality abortion itself is 14 times safer than birth, you know. And I think in general spreading information about the fact that if for people who are comforted by cross-sectional empirical studies that the World Health Organization has studied SMA and has like found how capable people are of autonomously supporting themselves. But yeah, I think it mostly feels really important because we can't rely on the state to protect our autonomy ever. And so we need to find ways to protect ourselves.
Thanks. So with all of that context, I'd like to talk some about this zine that Hazel mentioned, that Hazel authored, called How to Do It Anyway, which was written in June of 2022 in the wake of Roe v. Wade, of the overturning of Roe v. Wade, which is a pretty comprehensive overview of the self-managed abortion process. And that includes the process of making the decision about whether or not you want to do it, getting ready, what to expect after taking the pills, how to take care of your emotions, safety planning, and how to move forward after an abortion. And the zine is specifically for self-managing a medication abortion with, and I'm totally going to mispronounce these, so please correct me, but mifepristone and or misoprostol through the end of the 12th week of pregnancy. Did I pronounce those correctly?
Yes, it was great.
Okay, great.
We also often call them Miffy and Miso, if that's easier for you to handle.
Oh, that's definitely way easier for me to handle. Thank you. Miffy and Miso. So, Hazel, before we get into those specific elements, can you talk a little bit about why you decided to create this resource and why it feels so relevant now? And I'm wondering how you're seeing abortion providers responding or preparing for this new Trump presidency, and how this might be impacting self-managed abortions. And really, more than anything, like, are there some notable differences between this moment and June of 2022, right after Roe v. Wade was overturned?
Yeah, so I was in the clinic the day that Roe v. Wade was overturned, and by the time that we left at 5 p.m., the state Supreme Court had already ruled that a heartbeat law that had been passed a couple of years earlier would now be enforceable. And so basically like we had to cancel all of our patients for the next day because we weren't able to legally provide their abortions anymore. And at the time, I was working in the post-op recovery room. I was like taking people's blood pressures and kind of giving them the information that they needed on how to take care of themselves afterwards. And I was really like, I was also learning more about self-management at this time, and was like, it would be really nice to have like, because I would give all my patients this like, you know, little pamphlet with all the written down instructions. I was like, I want one of these that I can give to people who are taking pills themselves outside of the clinic. And I had also previously worked in counseling at that clinic, and so had a lot of experience sort of like navigating people who were uncertain and giving them resources and just kind of holding space for people's big emotions around their abortions, right? Because people do have a lot of people have a lot of emotions, and very little of them have to do with like the morality. Mostly like abortion, or like, you know, having an unexpected pregnancy and making the decision to have an abortion really brings up, oftentimes, not for everybody, but has the potential to really bring up big feelings about yourself, your relationship with your partner, your relationship with the family that you have right now, or the family that you want to have in the future, you know, your career dreams for yourself. It just often like really prompts this sort of big, really intense feelings for a lot of folks. And again, not everybody. I certainly also had a lot of patients who were like pretty fine and chill about it. You know, I think there is often this narrative that like abortion is really big and scary, and people are, you know, the right, the anti-choice activists love to say that like people get really depressed after abortions. And again, the evidence shows us that we know that's not true. But I think it is important to uplift that like people's emotional journeys through their abortions are all really different and varied. And I wanted a resource that also could speak to that and could help, you know, hold that complexity, and would have the resources for talk lines, to have sort of little self-reflection activities, to be like participatory, right? Like self-managing an abortion is about taking it back into your own hands. And I didn't want to just like give people information. I wanted them to be able to make it theirs. So that's kind of where it came from, is I was like, fuck SCOTUS, we're going to do it anyway. So I want to share. And I, you know, many people consulted on this zine. A lot of my coworkers from the clinic helped out in huge ways. And it is like sort of a collective love letter to like the patients that we weren't able to see anymore, of, you know, passing on all of the hot tips and tricks that we had.
Yeah. Thanks for that context. Your note around counseling people and supporting people through some of the emotional processing that sometimes people need to go through reminds me of an experience I remember having actually like in early high school, where one of my teachers shared with the class that she had had an abortion. And I think this is probably like pretty inappropriate, this whole the whole fact that this happened. But I had this teacher who shared with the class that she had had an abortion and she deeply regretted it. And it started this conversation within my class, where there were some students who were very, very religious and had really strong feelings and opinions about whether or not people should have abortions. And I remember that day sort of being publicly polled by some of these students, like, would you have an abortion? Like there was this very intense discussion that played out among the class about whether or not it was okay to have an abortion. And it seemed like what was being modeled for me by our teacher was like that it was this deeply fraught, very painful, regrettable thing. And I went home that day and told my mom about this conversation that we'd had in class. And I remember her being like, I had an abortion and it was totally fine. Like I needed to get an abortion and it was great for me. And that just like blew my mind as a kid, like seeing the contrast in like emotional responses that people can have to an abortion. And I think it was really important for me as a young person to like hear that it hadn't been difficult for my mom to have an abortion emotionally. And of course, like, I don't know how, you know, how much she was sharing with me, and I don't know how much our teacher was sharing with us, but I think that that was really important to have like different experiences modeled for me as a young person, and not have this sort of narrative that this is always a really terrible and difficult and painful thing, that you should have a lot of personal shame and guilt about. So I just wanted to add that in there because I think it was relevant to what you were sharing.
Yeah, thank you for that story. That's wild.
Yeah, thank you. Wow. Gosh.
Yeah. So I kind of like continuing off of that and talking a little bit more about the technicalities involved. What are, before getting into that, what are some of the key resources that you all think people should know about for helping to make a choice about the type of abortion that they want to have? I think there are some websites, but there might not just be websites. There might be like community groups or networks that you think it would be helpful for people to know about.
Yeah, so locally, MAADCO, or the Mountain Area Abortion Doula Collective, is definitely a resource for folks in the Southeast. And I know Holler Health Justice is another abortion collective. The Yellow Hammer Fund is in Alabama. So these are just like autonomous collectives in the Southeast that are doing work around abortion access and abortion autonomy. And I think, anybody that is like trained as an abortion doula, and, there's some like complexity about the term abortion doula because the root word or doula etymologically means slave, and so some people are kind of trying to put that terminology to bed a little bit and start using abortion companion. But any person that's trained as an abortion companion or doula is going to like hopefully have the skills to help somebody navigate the kinds of like options counseling that are often available at clinics. I know something that is really critical for folks in a lot of red states is to be really wary of crisis pregnancy centers, because they are these like really freaky entities that often like advertise themselves as somewhat neutral health centers that will help you make your decision about your pregnancy that you're feeling unsure about, but then they spread a lot of really scary misinformation. They like show picture of like basically like giant pictures of like giant baby dolls inside of people and are like, this is your baby, and it's like very much not. And they like sell like all these like supplements that aren't approved by the FDA anyway. So making sure to be like wary of that, and reaching out to local community. Oftentimes, not always, like sometimes like if you have like a more rad domestic violence shelter locally. But yeah, I'm not super as familiar with online resources. I know Abortion Finder is a helpful resource. Plan C pills and Aid Access are three that I know folks have used. But yeah, curious if you have more ideas, Hazel.
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo Plan C pills and Abortion Finder. Plan C pills is a educational website basically that has a lot of rounded up resources on how to source abortion pills, how to, dose them and what to look out for. I think if you are someone who is thinking that like a clinic abortion or a procedural abortion might be more up your alley, maybe you're worried about like if you want access to pain management, some sedation, or the sort of legal cover is important to you, starting with like the National Network of Abortion Funds. They can help you get connected to an abortion fund in your area for some financial aid options. They can also usually connect you to practical support organizations. So these are organizations that maybe don't specialize in fundraising and giving people a lot of money for their abortions, but maybe they're like organizing like ride shares to clinics, or they could maybe help with childcare. And sometimes those are nonprofits, and sometimes they're more like community-based mutual aid networks.
Gotcha. So what are some of the key elements of this process that you think everyone should know about? And I know that's a really broad question, but I think the reason I'm asking that is because I think if people are going to do a self-managed abortion, it would be useful to use resources like your zine that they can review as many times as they need, rather than like a talk, like a conversational radio show. But I do think it's helpful to just name kind of broadly to take people through this process, and not just for people who are like maybe going to do it, but for people who care about people who are maybe going to do it. I think that would be really helpful. And I guess one specific question that's sort of leading us in the sort of technical direction that I'm hoping to get into here is like, for example, like, do you know if the medications used for self-managed abortions can interact with other medications that people are on, that would be something for people to think about.
Well, one resource I just remembered is like SAS, which is Safe and Supported Self-Managed Abortion. And they both have, so you can look this up, they both have manuals that really kind of like go through fairly exhaustive questions. And I believe, I don't know if this is still active, but I believe they also have like a hotline where you can text people anonymous questions, which I think can be really, really helpful for folks, especially people that are a little more isolated, having somebody like online and available. There is a website that you can use to look up general drug interactions. I think it's like rxlist.com.
Yeah. While we're on medical hotlines, I want to also plug the miscarriage and abortion hotline, which is a similar text hotline that will get you in contact with like medical advice, particularly if you are self-managing an abortion and, you're maybe concerned about something that you're seeing. To my knowledge, when I was doing screening at the clinic, there wasn't like a particular medication that we were looking for that would be affected. I still think that you should probably do your own research, but generally when we were doing screening, we were looking more for conditions that would make the abortion unsafe. And those are typically like bleeding disorders, whether you clot too easily or your blood doesn't clot at all, just sort of trying to reduce risk around a complication involving bleeding.
I would say one more common thing outside of having like, there's a couple of different bleeding disorders like hemophilia and like inherited porphyria that are like more uncommon, but if people have an IUD, it's really important that they take it out before they self-manage an abortion. And I think some people don't know that. So
yeah, whether or not you're planning to carry a pregnancy to full term or to get an abortion, it is like very important to take the IUD out as soon as you get a positive pregnancy test.
Gotcha. And that's not something people can do on their own, or is that also done outside of a clinic?
People do it on their own. And I think it's definitely possible. And I think that personally I've seen that a little bit less, but it's also pretty easy to get an IUD taken out by like a health department, and somebody could just be like, I'm so excited, I really want to be pregnant now, and it's usually like whatever, usually they're like, great, we love forcing people to give birth, like let's take your IUD out, and so, but that's not to say people can take their own IUDs out. I don't know of too many resources about that.
Gotcha. And so also coming back to this question, what do you think are key elements of the process that you think everyone should know about?
Yeah. To like give sort of a high level of what we're talking about. So there's two medications. You mentioned them early, mifepristone or Mifi, and misoprostol, also called miso. Typically, people will take both of them. So you'll take a dose of mifepristone, and then 24 to 48 hours later, you'll take a dose of misoprostol or miso. Mifi is swallowed normally. Misoprostol has to be held either in the cheek pockets, in your mouth, so that it absorbs in, held under the tongue, or inserted directly into your vagina. And that's so that the medication gets absorbed sort of directly into your bloodstream. If you swallow it like a normal pill, it's probably just going to make you nauseous. It's not going to do very much. First medication, Mifi, is not going to do a whole lot. It might make you a little bit nauseous. You might see some spotting, but it's really that second medication, misoprostol, that's the one that makes you bleed and cramp. And it also has a lot of side effects associated with it that are pretty easy to manage if you know to expect them and just do some prep work about it. Generally, the bleeding will start about 20 minutes after your first dose of miso, and then it'll last kind of between like 8 hours and 24 hours. But there's like a pretty big range of what's considered normal, and it's going to depend on like sort of how far you are into your pregnancy. And again, just to note, like I'm using second person language here because it's easy and comfortable for me, and not because I want to make assumptions about what you, the listener, are going through or have been through before. We didn't say at the top, neither of us are medical professionals. This isn't medical advice. Ask a trusted healthcare provider if you have questions about any of this stuff. So the heaviest bleeding is going to last for about 24 hours. And then after that, we'll sort of slow down and be more similar to like what your normal period is for, again, on average about a week, but there's a pretty big range of what's considered normal between 3 days and 3 weeks. During this time, there's some stuff to look out for. Basically, you want to make sure that you're not bleeding too much, you're not passing really big blood clots, you're not in like too much pain, and that you're not running a fever. Those can all be signs of a complication, which would be pretty rare. Typically, complications are seen in about less than 0.5% of medication abortion cases. And what that is most typically is an infection after the procedure or after the medication. And there's some easy things that you can do to sort of avoid that and decrease that risk. There is about a 1 in 20 chance, a 5% chance, that you'll take the medication and you either won't pass all the tissue or it won't be effective. And in that case, you can either you can take more medication if that's what you feel comfortable with, or you can seek further health care. That's sort of up to you in that situation. And there's the zine that I wrote and also plenty more resources online about, how to tell what's going on, how to tell if you need to reach out for health care or like further continued care and all of that stuff.
I think that was, excellent overview. Yeah, I think, a couple things it's recommended to take Dramamine and ibuprofen, like, before you take misoprostol, just to mitigate some of those effects, and that the protocol is a little bit different if a person only has access to misoprostol. Basically, they end up taking 4 pills in like 3 different rounds, and I think a general consensus is that it's often best to take the pills in the cheeks, which is called bakali, or sometimes I refer to it as being kind of like the way you take dip. I think it gets some incomprehensible way for people. People are like, what do you mean in the cheeks? But just because it's easier to swallow under the tongue, and then sometimes there's a fear that if there is residue in the vagina, then a person did have to go to the hospital for a complication that could be seen. So that's one thing that folks say. But yeah, the protocol is there's 12 pills in total taken in 3 rounds, 3 hours apart, 4 at a time. And then there's also like a delay to the start of bleeding, but that is still an effective method. There's, again, like a ton of guides and a ton of guidance online about this, but just to give a brief overview.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think it's useful to just have that overview and a general understanding of what the steps are. And maybe I should have asked this sooner, but how is the length of a pregnancy measured? Because I saw that's actually very, very technical. And up to what stage in a pregnancy is it appropriate to do a self-managed abortion?
Yeah, so a pregnancy is measured from the first state of your last menstrual period, your LMP, right? So if we are recording this in like late January right now, and so if I had a positive pregnancy test today, I would kind of look back on my calendar and think about the last time that I had a period, about 4 weeks ago. When was the first date that started? And so usually pregnancy tests start to be accurate. They start to be super, super accurate around 28 days after that first date of your last menstrual period. It's not measured from like the day that you had sex or from the day that you ovulated or from that day of your first pregnancy test. It's that LMP. And yeah, so the literature on this, and I'm like using like language of evidence and stuff here because I published a zine and this is what I spent a lot of time looking at. I don't mean this to like degrade the very real, anecdotal experiences that people have, right? But so based on like the medical studies, particularly the ones that are cited by the World Health Organization and by IPAS, which is like another, big global transnational public health agency that focuses specifically on abortion, they recommend that self-management is appropriate through the end of like the 11th or 12th week of pregnancy. Again, that's relative to the first date of your last menstrual period. It is theoretically possible to use medication to induce an abortion after that point. The concern is that the risks are a lot higher because, the pregnancy is more established in the body. The cervix is going to need to dilate more to pass all of the pregnancy tissue. And so it just becomes much more tricky. And at that point, it's more appropriate to seek an abortion in a clinic setting, just to make sure that you have medical guidance and that like the risk that something happens is mitigated.
Thanks. And how do you know that an abortion has actually worked? Like, what are you looking for? I think earlier on, one of you said that this is actually not super clear. Like, different people might have different understandings of when an abortion has actually been completed. But I'm wondering if you could speak more to that.
Yeah, so this could be a cause of a lot of concern and stress for a lot of people because the hormone that is like measured by a typical urine pregnancy test can remain in the body for up to 2 weeks, even 3 weeks after an abortion is complete. And so really the only like absolutely surefire way to know if an abortion has been complete is to get an ultrasound, which is unfortunate because that can be really inaccessible for people for a lot of reasons. But another way to know is that when the symptoms of pregnancy start to diminish. So if a person had like breast tenderness or sensitivity to smells, like that those symptoms would be going away. I think also, like, it depends on how far along somebody is. Also, like, passage of a fairly significant amount of blood and the products of pregnancy themselves are really important. There are sometimes instances where people will have incomplete abortions. So they'll bleed a little bit, but not enough, or people won't bleed at all. So, yeah, I mean, I think I often counsel, whenever, just even in like, if somebody went to a clinic and got medication from a clinic, they could still feel really confused about the same thing, right? And so usually then they would like go back and have an ultrasound and just confirm it.
Yeah, so in the clinic, we were usually looking to kind of, like you said, that you had a period of like more intense bleeding for like 24 hours, right? Like we know that the medication worked. And then it tapers off after that and eventually stops. There isn't like longer lasting damage to the uterus that's going on. So like kind of seeing that peak and then coming down is like also usually a pretty good sign. And you mentioned this a little bit as well, but like it's kind of complicated because it's different for each pregnancy. It's different based on how far along in the pregnancy you are, but you can sort of try to look through the contents of what you're actually passing. And again, if you're seeing some specific stuff, I'm not going to name it right now because it's a little bit more intense, but you can go read about this in the zine, or there's plenty of other resources online. There's specific kinds of tissue that you're looking for. And if you see that being passed, that means your abortion is probably complete. If you don't see that, it doesn't necessarily mean that your abortion didn't work. Especially if you're earlier on, the pregnancy just isn't as developed. It's a lot smaller. It's a lot easier to miss. And just, generally, like, we're not perfect people. We're not going to be able to see everything all the time. If you're, peeing in the middle of the night, you might miss it. But yeah, those are sort of the easy ways that I have known. But again, the most surefire, quickest way is to get an ultrasound that is not accessible for a lot of reasons. I think we're thinking about the sort of documentation and paper trail that an ultrasound might create. Around 4 weeks after your abortion, a pregnancy test should be coming up negative, but again, that takes a while. If it's still positive, that could either mean that your abortion was incomplete or that you have a new pregnancy altogether. And that's going to be something as well that you reach out to, like, you just go to get an ultrasound to see what's going on.
Gotcha. How painful is self-managed abortion, and what are some good pain management and care strategies?
Yeah, I mean, something I do want to offer and to, in the spirit of like deep and radical honesty is that for most people, or for a lot of people, self-managed abortion is incredibly painful. And I think sometimes because in our effort to counter forced birth and anti-abortion propaganda, sometimes that element does get diminished. Like, and it's just the reality that a procedure can both be painful and safe at the same time. And for some people, it is less painful, but I have heard of people being a little bit shocked by that. But some mechanisms to move through those experiences, really, really like depends on what sources of comfort are already like accessible to somebody and already like within their like template of how they like soothe and parent themselves, But I think, baseline, like ibuprofen, if somebody can take it, like 800 milligrams is really helpful. Heating pads, super helpful. Distraction is usually super helpful. Like certain kinds of pelvic massage can be really helpful to people. Sometimes like cannabis is helpful to people, you know, and I think it's important to not be judgmental about like the mechanisms people use while remaining like aware of safety. And different kind of herbal aromatics can be really helpful too as nervous system soothers. Yeah, and so the list goes on and on. There's so many different mechanisms that you can use to support a person in this position. But I think another really critical piece of managing pain is like moving away from atomization and isolation again. And so somebody knowing that there's somebody watching after them and caring for them can really shift a person's psychic experience of pain.
Hazel, did you have anything to add to that? I also want to add that my next question was around the kinds of rituals that you see people engaging in around abortions and some of the ways that you all see people taking care of themselves or taking care of each other to stay comfortable through the process. So I'm realizing now that it's sort of related to this question. So if you have thoughts around both of those questions, that's helpful.
Yeah. I mean, I think like in terms of pain management, just some stuff from my own list that I haven't heard and from Jane's very wonderful and amazing list. Sometimes when your body is having a really big cramp, that's because there's a clot that's stuck. Once your body's like cramping up really hard to try to get it out. And so if you go sit on the toilet and then bear down, you know, kind of like you're trying to pass a bowel movement, you're trying to take a poop, that can help dislodge the clot and help alleviate the cramping. Jane mentioned using weed to cope, and I think that weed can often be, you want to be careful about it, right? You want to stay present and stay aware so you know what's going on. But weed is an oxytocic plant. It has oxytocic properties, meaning that it stimulates oxytocin in your body, which is one of the chemicals that, or one of the hormones that we're actually really trying to work with during an abortion. It is a hormone that, like, after full-term childbirth or after an abortion, after a miscarriage, kind of helps your uterus shrink back down to normal size and helps alleviate pain by, you know, facilitating bonding. And it's the one that you like feel cuddly with, right? And so other ways that you can stimulate that are like if if there's someone in your life who you feel really comfortable being touchy with, whether that's a partner or a sibling or your best friend, you know, just kind of having some gentle, consensual, stimulating touch, getting that oxytocin going can be helpful both for pain management as well as like actually facilitating your abortion. And sometimes people are like, don't fucking touch me. Like I'm having a rough time right now. I need to just get through this. So, you know, your mileage may vary with that one. And then last one is just sort of like mindfulness and mindset techniques, you know, focusing on your breathing, focusing on walking, giving your mind something else to think about, you know, memorizing like a chorus to a favorite song and sort of using that to time and pace out your cramps, you know. And again, just like what Jane was saying earlier, like pain is a physical sensation, and there's also this like real emotional element to it, right? Where it can become suffering. And so if we're able to like stay grounded and kind of sit and like, I am in a lot of physical discomfort right now, but that doesn't have to become fear. It doesn't have to become tension in my body. It doesn't have to become despair. It doesn't have to become loneliness. And just sort of letting that physical pain pass through without sitting in your emotional suffering, I think can also really help with that stuff.
Do you have thoughts on this rituals question?
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting one because it's so profoundly cultural and also so profoundly like particular to both the spirituality of the person having the abortion and also how they conceive of the process, because not everyone is going to necessarily maybe like want to engage at least immediately, I think, after going through such transformative and often really logistically overwhelming experience. A lot of people, you know, whether by the force of capitalism or just because it's their own personality, just kind of want to go back to their lives. But people also do really engage in really interesting like ways of honoring that process in themselves. Like I've heard people doing silent meditations. I've heard people taking products of pregnancy and bringing them to a place in the water or to some kind of like sacred space in nature that they connect to, or and a lot of people also having like abortion. I've heard a recent like thing where people had like an abortion shower, which I thought was kind of cool. And just like having sort of like more group celebratory activity. But yeah, I think that like how somebody wants to engage with that practice, and even just like doing some really deep journaling is something that I've seen a lot of folks do too, or making art that feels like important to them. But yeah, I think that the like possibilities are as expensive and endless as the like populations of people seeking abortion are.
Yeah, I would really agree with that. Some examples that come to mind, particularly from my clinic days, are that a lot of my patients would make art or like, you know, sort of in their process of release would like write some art for their pregnancy or, you know, depending on how they're conceiving of it, like for the like their child who they're like letting go of having that future with. That was like a pretty common thing that people did to like, you know, sort of process and move on. There were also in the waiting rooms of my clinic, there were sort of shared journals that people would use, and there were and like even just sort of in the magazines that were there, people would write letters to each other, of letters of support, of like, you're not doing this alone, even if you feel like you are. And so that way to sort of connect across time with people who have, you know, been in the same chair, been in similar situations to you, you know, without needing to like physically share the same space. I know that a lot of my patients really appreciated that as well.
That's really beautiful. Thanks for those examples. So I want to close out with one more question to you all, and then I'll ask if you have anything else to add to this discussion. I'm wondering if you can talk about why you personally decided to do this work.
I can start. Yeah. So when I was 24, I was living in Eastern Kentucky and in a pretty difficult and abusive relationship. And I got pregnant and I just moved there. It was like super rural and isolated. And so I didn't really know many people. And I remember going to the health clinic, the like local clinic, to just confirm that I was pregnant, and they confirmed it. And then I was like, okay, I don't want to be pregnant. We're going to get an abortion. And they literally started signing me up for WIC, and they started like giving me lists of OBGYNs that could like deliver the baby. And I just remember like the profound terror and powerlessness of that place and the loneliness of it too. And I think that like what motorizes me to do this work at a really personal level is that I don't want anyone in the world, particularly people who are experiencing other forms of systemic powerlessness, to like experience that like sunken terror that I did. And I know that like if I had had accompaniment in that experience, it would have felt really different. And you know, where I lived was like 4.5 hours away from the closest abortion clinic too. And so I ended up having to just like travel to a different state. And then I think it's been really profound connecting to the lineages of people like eons past and eons in the future who will like always choose this like beautiful technology to like author our own destinies and author our own selves. And yeah, I felt really lucky to have found comrades and friends of like all stripes and particularities and like many unlikely places who are also devoted to this work. And I was really lucky to learn from some abortion doulas that were really, really intent on teaching folks about SMA around like almost 7 years ago now. Right after I had that experience, I kind of came into contact with some folks. So that's my story. Yeah, and I'm really grateful to do this work now.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. That's really beautiful.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I don't have as nice of a story. I had moved back to the city and was looking for a job. And one of my friends who was a little bit older, who was like a really cool radical parent, worked at the local abortion clinic, and I was able to sort of get a job in there. And yeah, I was just really moved and really struck by both like how impactful it was. I was really struck by like feeling like I could do something really tangible and impactful for other people. And also like just how much of a need there was. And that, you know, I could see like the clinic really straining both against state power, against medical industrial complex, against nonprofit industrial complex bullshit. Like there's like so much work to be done. Yeah, I don't have like a nice story with a bow. I just kind of fell into it and feel really grateful to everybody who, you know, sort of taught me what I know. And the best way that I have to honor the patients that I worked with, to honor my coworkers, is to like just to continue to share and to continue to build support and solidarity. Yeah.
Thank you. So finally, is there anything else that you all feel like we haven't touched on that you'd like to add or let listeners know about?
Just to support your local abortion funds, and to also like support the people in your life that are, you know, caring for folks seeking abortions, that are seeking abortions, that are pregnant. Like I think again, like the more that we widen and disseminate and decentralize these networks of care, the stronger we are.
Yeah, agreed. And also like if there is a practical support organization in your area, you know, to sort of figure out how to get involved with them, that's a really good place to start, is like just to give people rides to clinics and, you know, bear witness to their stories, you know, as much as they want to share with you. I think that's like it's just a really good entry point into this work. Clinic escorting as well is like another pretty easy entryway.
Well, thank you both so much for your time and for sharing so much and for all this information. I think this has been a pretty comprehensive overview. I hope that people have learned some new things that they didn't know about before. Yeah, really appreciate the time, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of The Beautiful Idea. News and analysis from the front lines of anarchist and autonomous struggles everywhere. Catch you next time.